Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. And I do hope that you are joining us from all over the world for this really important conversation. I'm Safwan Masri. I'm Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. And on behalf of all of us at Columbia, and in particular, the Global Center in Amman, where I am right now, it's truly my pleasure to welcome and thank you for joining us. We're gathered to discuss the book We Wrote in Symbols, Love and Lust by Arab Women Writers, a book that masterfully celebrates the selected work of 75 women of Arab heritage, from the acclaimed to the anonymous, whose short stories, novel excerpts, and poetry address themes of desire, agency, and gender, and span a period of 3 millennia. It is, quite simply, groundbreaking. The narrative themes within this book by women who represent the diverse cultures of Southwest Asia and North Africa have rarely been seen or discussed by the broader society, despite the universality of our human connection to love, lust, and longing. Humanity everywhere and at any period of time experiences vulnerability, secrecy, and shame, and same-sex attraction and gender fluidity. This last topic especially resonates deeply for me. In most Arab, in most Arab social contexts, what we would now refer to as queer expression or identity is a major taboo, and it is rarely discussed. The same can be said of sex depicted outside the bounds of monogamous marriage, though as we see in this collection, social norms are constantly contested and can change dramatically across different periods of time and different locales. There's much more to be said, but I'm eager to get to the discussion with our panelists who will help us explore how literature can reclaim the narratives of those whose stories have been suppressed or marginalized and restore them to their places in the world. Today's moderator is Marsha Lynx Quayle. Marsha is a writer, translator, and the founding editor-in-chief of Arab Lit, a translator-centered collective that produces the Arab Lit Quarterly, ALQ Books, a website and a limited book series focused on Arabic. She is also a freelance journalist based in Rabat, Morocco, who keeps her finger on the pulse of the Arab literary world across a wide range of genres and countries. Welcome, Marsha. With us also is Lean Gaspar, Managing Director and Publisher of Saqi Books. Lean is a trustee of the Shabak Festival and sits on the English Pen Writers and Translation Committee. She was shortlisted for the Independent Publishers Guild Young Publisher of the Year Award in 2013. Saqi Books was established in London in 1978, and its sister company, Dar es-Saqi, was founded in Beirut in 1989. Over the past 30 years, through releasing innovative and seminal works about the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, in English and Arabic, Saqi has become a byword for the development and promotion of Middle Eastern culture. Hi, Lean. And finally, Salma Dabbagh, the editor of We Wrote in Symbols, a British Palestinian writer of fiction. And I am grateful to say, someone whose friendship I cherish and whose work, both as a literary artist and on behalf of Palestine and Palestinianness, I greatly admire. Her first novel, Out of It, was a Guardian Book of the Year and was awarded the Premio Opera in Spoleto. She has also written short stories that have appeared in Granta, International Pen, and Wasafiri magazine, as well as in several anthologies published by Saqi Books. Her writing often, but not always, focuses on contemporary Middle East diaspora experiences and Palestinian themes. Salma also works on scripts for film and TV, as well as plays for radio and stage. Salma, it's really wonderful to finally be sharing the stage with you. With anticipation and also gratitude, I turn it now to Marsha to lead our discussion. Thank you. Marsha?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I just want to say quickly to the audience that because this is, a digital event, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A area at any time, and we can sort through them there, and we will have a question and answer period a little bit later. So whenever you think of it, go ahead and type in the question. So I wanted to start with Salma about the genesis of this collection, how it came about, and then also if you would also read one of the pieces that originally inspired this anthology project.
Thank you, Marsha, and thank you, Safwan, for an amazingly generous and warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. If I talk too much about this question of where this idea came from, you have to stop me, because it came from many different places. I'm English Palestinian and I grew up in Kuwait, so my Arabic has never been as good as Marsha's, so I can't read Arabic texts in the original. And as a writer, I started to find that I don't know that there's a sort of chill factor in the way that I write. When I write about anything which comes towards love or the erotic, I feel a bit I shy away from it a little bit. And I came across, when I was writing out of it, I came across these classical poems by Arab women that Lena had published with Saki. And to be honest, they were a complete shocker and a revelation to me, because I had no idea that women were A, writing so long ago in the Arab world, and B, that they were so fresh and so kind of pithy and self-assured. And on issues to do with the erotic, they were very kind of unashamed and unabashed about stating their desires. And there were women who, who the object of their desire didn't really seem to matter, like Alaya bint Mahdi. So one of the pieces I'm just going to read, I've got a couple of short pieces, but one of them by Sophia Alvarez, it just gives across some of the spirit of the confidence, which I love. It's called I Am a Wonder. And it says, I am the wonder of the world, the ravisher of hearts and minds. Once you've seen my stunning looks, you're a fallen man. It's like such a diss. It's sort of like a bit like a kind of, there's something very hip about that. So I love that. And then I've always read very broadly. And I think that with some of the sort of English literature I was reading with sort of contemporary writers, I was often finding the explanations on, the descriptions of the hookup culture a little bit alienating. And one of the pieces in here that I wanted from the outset, by Ahdaf Swave, I feel that the way that she dealt with the sort of navigating sexual politics and blending it with, politics in the bigger sphere was so skilled. And I started to look more towards Arab writers who are doing this and looking at this navigation, particularly when it's transgressive and it's a little bit forbidden. So then the idea came to me, which I presented to Saki, was the idea of just looking at women's voices through these periods, like seeing this early pre-Islamic period, the Jahiliyyah period, and then going forward, Abbasid, Umayyad, Andalusian, and then there's a stop, 1492, there's like a blackout period, like 500 years where women aren't writing about this subject, and then it starts again gradually end of the 19th century and builds up. And I think in the last 20 years it has really changed. There's been so much movement in this area, and it's so rare to have something positive, dynamic, full of love, to have the religions of the region connected with love rather than violence and hatred. So that was the idea, that was a basic idea behind it. And I wanted a sort of spirit of the book, which was something between kind of like a harem and a book club, because I've always been in book clubs, and like particularly where I live in North London, there's a kind of nobody wants to deal with Arab writing, and it's like, how can I make this essentially sexy? How can I show how much good writing we've got from this region? What variety, like it's kind of like break out of these stereotypes, which are so stifling and dulling and inaccurate. So that's my answer.
So Lynn, so Salma has crafted this idea, and then she comes and she approaches you with it. So what appealed to you about the idea, and what was your role in shaping the book, and if you would, select some piece that you could read that's really struck you through the process?
Salma and I have known each other for a number of years. I've long admired her person and her writing. And when she approached me, honestly, I felt like she just offered me a massive gift. I mean, Saki has, for the last 4 decades, since the early 80s, we've been publishing in English. We've been translating seminal works from Arabic into English, both scholarly and literary, there is a huge dearth, there is such a gap, there is such an opportunity to share our rich literary heritage. And there have been a number of wonderful anthologies over the past few decades of classical Arab writing, of contemporary, of modern, and so on, and we've published a few. But Salma was suggesting something even more exciting, an anthology solely of women writers and on erotica, a collection of writings of love and erotica. I mean, how empowering, how absolutely wonderful, and how important today for us to be representing these voices. Saki has always sought to offer a platform for, to marginalized, between quote mark communities, to other voices principally from the Arab world, but also from beyond, right, through our other imprints. So, I mean, this fits perfectly in our list, on our list. And in terms of shaping, I think it was a pretty enjoyable collaborative experience. I mean, as a publisher, we hope anyway, that we support and guide our authors as much as they need, and it was, my goodness, I mean, you can imagine this is an anthology and it's the first of its kind in English, there's actually so much. One of the reviewers, when they reviewed the collection, said, you think it's going to be a short book? It's 320 pages. And it could have been far, far longer. This is just the beginning. Imagine the potential, as I said earlier, So Salma did an incredible job, because there was such responsibility that the editor faces in selecting the pieces. So yes, Salma read this brilliant short poem, which I think was from the 12th century, which is fantastic. I've also selected a few, just 2 short poems. No, don't worry. The first is by Shuruk Amin, and her poem is entitled Another Kind of Love. I think Safwan will appreciate this one. When one squints, the other dims the moonlight for her. Such is friendship, or so your parents think, heedless of limbs that tangle like limp honeysuckle petals in the early evening. Before the sky darkens much, before the muezzin cries the day's last call for prayer, before your mother uncovers the shallow depressions in your mattress, made by not one, but 2 daughters of Muslims. And the other extract, so this is a contemporary piece that I just read. The other extract is from the 11th century by Eitimad Arumekia, who was replying to her husband, who was outside of Seville where they were living at the time. So this is in the Andalus, period, and who was asking her when she was going to join him. And she says, so this is entitled, I urge you to come. I urge you to come faster than the wind, to mount my breast and firmly dig and plow my body, and don't let go until you flushed me thrice. 12th century, or no, 11th century. Voila, those were my extracts.
Excellent. Thank you so much for reading those. So Selma had mentioned that one of her interests in this was about breaking stereotypes, and I wondered, just lean quick, how you because one of the stereotypes is, sort of this exotic, sexualized Arab woman, Muslim woman, she's maybe covered, but her eyes are peeking out, and they're lined with kohl, and she is, sexy as well.
Lifting the veil.
Yes, lifting the veil.
Yes.
You know, there was this recent French study on the back jackets of Arabic books translated into French, and sort of breaking the taboo is like the most common thing. So how do you as a publisher sort of tread this line between, you know, showing this incredibly rich vein of literature that I think anyone can relate to and that is really sort of uplifting, and, you know, exoticizing?
Such an important question. Thank you for asking it. Safwan put his finger on it in his incredibly generous introduction to the book, although very accurate. Generous and accurate. You know, we're lucky, Saki, we're in an enviable position because we are, you know, we're a product of the Middle East. We have direct links to the Middle East. I think it's very easy to exoticize when you're writing about an other that you may be unfamiliar with. And sometimes you're familiar with them and you're still exoticizing them. But we have this advantage. We have this atout, you know. Of course, it's always a consideration, but it's not a dilemma that we faced with this book. Again, you know, this is a space, we have carved out a space. And this is what we've been doing for decades. And this is what Salma, why this book is so significant, because she has carved out a space for these women to share their own expressions, you know, their literary crafts, but also their expressions of love and sexuality and desires, you know, for them to share. They are expressing, it is their voice that we're sharing. And the packaging, everything else was just a question of respecting the craft, you know, from my perspective. I think, as Safwan very rightly said, this is a question of reclaiming the narrative, of reclaiming a space. You know, we have been, and by we, I mean Arabs, have been in the news more. I would love to read, there have been, of course, studies on this. There's data, there's stats, you know, but, you know, 9/11, Iraq, you know, the various jihads, the various, you know, the Arab Spring. I mean, we have been in the news nonstop. It feels like there isn't a day that goes by that Arabs aren't in the sort of consciousness of Westerners. Yet it feels that the gulf has widened. Yes, there has also been an increase in publications about the Arab world, but who is writing these books and what are they about? You know, and I'd love to share statistics, if you don't mind my doing so now.
Sure.
You know, bearing in mind that Arabic is the 6th most spoken language in the world, it is very interesting, utterly depressing, to note that, you know, based on 2015 figures, the average number of books, of Arabic books translated, literary works translated from Arabic into English in the UK, averaged at 10 to 12 a year. And this is out of 90,000 books published on average at that time, you know? I mean, it's a tiny, so there is a real opportunity here. So when Salma comes to me and says, I've got this book idea, you say, thank you. Absolutely, you know. So yes, I hope that's, it is very tiring to be misrepresented constantly. I think one of the surefire ways to avoid that is to ensure that the source, you know, that you have expertise, that you have knowledge, and that you treat the subject with the respect that it deserves. I think Masha has frozen.
Yeah, Masha has frozen. So maybe I'll interject with a question, which sort of, I mean, putting aside perhaps, I mean, it's not, oh, Masha's back. Masha was starting to interject a question. So maybe I'll go on with it, if you don't mind. And that is, I mean, you know, it's clear, Salma, also from the way that you explained sort of what motivated you to write this book and how the kinds of things that you came across as you were writing out of it, it makes sense why you would choose writers who spoke and who wrote in the Arabic language. But I wonder if you or Lean could speak to the notion of Arabic speaking and identity through language, as opposed to, you know, Arab world and how we define it. You know, and lean, for example, when with Saki, are you looking at, you know, works from the geographic region or of the language? So I just, you know, very interested in your views on sort of the dynamics between, or the tensions, if you will, between language and geography and identity.
Yeah. Can I just say on that point that that one of the main drivers for me was to find, can you hear me? Was to find, was to keep everything as diverse as possible. So we've got writers who write in English, French, and Arabic, and we've also represented all three religions or no religion. We've got, was trying to promote the North African region, who mainly write in French and Arabic, are often not as available to English language readers. So I was working very closely with translators to identify writers who might have gone under the radar a little bit, that we weren't aware of, to sort of, so it was to keep a sort of a breadth. I mean, that was really my rule, breadth and diversity and range of nationalities and places that the writers came from, to sort of disrupt the idea of a sort of homogeneity of identity, perhaps. But still, even if you come from all these different places, I mean, you're talking about the contemporary writers, that the response to you is labeling, and that can be dulling. So it's sometimes a movement around a label that is being provided from externally. So sometimes you have the writing which is kind of speaking out in a way, or speaking back, a little bit conscious in that way. You might find that coming through. What do you think, Lean?
I think you've put it very well. And I think you've made me think of another point around anthologies and grouping writers in this way, and also labeling them as Arab writers. And that's sort of the hook. I mean, on the one hand, it's a strength, because from my perspective, from a marketing and commercial perspective, I can go in and sell that. You know, it's something that stands out. It has very strong selling point, and so on and so forth. But on the flip side, I can see sort of at a more intellectual and even an emotional level how that is constricting, and it is slightly reductive. You know, what is it that binds us? You know, I mean, we're going into sort of more philosophical, you know, what is it that binds us? Is it our language? Is it our culture? You know, but if you think of, as Salma was saying, I mean, is it 400 and something million people who speak Arabic around the world? You know, I mean, it's a huge number, and it's obviously growing. So it's something that we have to grapple with, but you sort of operate within the reality, you know, and you know, you do the best that you can, essentially. But as Salma said, it's sort of reflective of how, because you asked how do we understand this at Saki as well as a publisher. You know, when I said that we've published minority voices, it's not only communities who consider themselves as Arab. You know, we publish Kurds and Druze and books about and by these communities, from these communities, you know, Jews and so on and so forth. So quite a disparate. And I think that it's possible to celebrate, showcase, feature the full range, the full kaleidoscope of being, of identities, of voices, of languages, yet still be aware of what binds us together, yet still be aware of, you know, our commonality as Arabs, as humans, you know, of citizens of this world. And I think that really reflects our ethos at Saki.
Thank you.
And I think that,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Back to you, Marsha.
Apologies for my internet trouble. Hartmut Frendrich is just asking if, Lean, I know you have a copy of the book, if you would just hold it up so we can see what it is that, and some also see what it is we're talking about. Okay, thank you.
The sexy book we were talking about.
Yes, sexy book. And I do want to talk about the cover process at some point, but I want to, because both of you have said, I think, you know, and this was back in the 11th century, and this was in the 12th century, you know, as if we're imagining that we've, you know, progressed somehow, that we're more liberated. And, you know, certainly in some ways, you know, life is very different. And although, you know, I can't imagine writing about sex in the way that Zed Mehmed, for instance, did, and Abbasid Iraq in the 11th century. And so I wanted to ask what it is about these classical works that is so salient that really struck you, Salma, and why you wanted to include this breadth of work, these works from the Jahiliyyah period through the Abbasid era to, you know, contemporary works that have only recently been written?
I mean, I think in terms of it was partly this idea of just getting a way of stripping, you know, if you strip people down to the core, you know, this fundamental desire to love and to you know, the sort of the sexual desire is like key, you know, some of the oldest statues that you'll find thousands of years old will be of couples in embrace. So it's such a key way that, you know, humans have always interacted with each other. But then you have societies which come on top of that and have different rules about it. So by looking at the writing itself, you can kind of just, it's a very, and just like a way of seeing how it's modulated over time. And we, when we were putting together the ordering of the pieces, at first we were thinking, you know, that we'd have these sort of Jahiliyyah pieces, and then we'd show that how there was this sort of period of silence and then it builds up again. But actually it didn't seem right, because we were kind of getting voices across the era that were speaking to each other, that were very close to each other in terms of personality or outlook or the moment, or even the way that they might have referred to, I don't know, the moon or the sun or nature, and brought that into their sort of expression. So that we had lots of different ways of moving the pieces around before we arrived at the arc that we were left with in the end, which was more just a feeling of sort of, you know, kind of following an emotional flow of like a glance or a meeting, and then building up, and then sort of some of the women towards the end are more kind of these sort of high priestess type women who know it all and are kind of teaching other people. So, but I think the older pieces, and you know, is what's so pure about them is that we can't see what the women might have looked like. I find it very difficult to visualize them, who they were talking to, how many people were being addressed by these words, where were they when they wrote it. So it's kind of amorphous. So you're just taking the emotion. And I think with that, you can feel that it's something you allow yourself to get closer to. Perhaps the modern ones, you can see them, and then and we're so ready to cast judgments on anything to do with sexuality. It's like an instant, like, you know, we like this person, don't like this person about the way they present in that respect. It's very judgmental. So they're like little arrows of, like, you know, just a feeling that I think can connect across the era, across nationalities, etc., etc.
So assertive. You know,
Yeah.
For me, I think, Marsha, you mentioned the word progress. It's a regression. You know, it's incredibly empowering to me as a woman, as a Western and as an Arab woman. It's not just empowering for an Arab, it's empowering for women, full stop. Because we were embracing the full extent of our sexuality, or the full extent of our desires, and we were affirming them loud and proud, you know, 3,000 years ago. Imagine, you know, and there are records. And compare this in English. The earliest record of a woman writing is in the 8th, according to this new publication. It's always been thought to be the 12th or 13th, I think, the 12th or 14th century, but now they found writing in the 8th century. And this is in English. I mean, okay, it could be, we could go into historiography and sort of misogyny across the ages and all this stuff, you know, are there records and has there been sufficient research in this domain? But still, we have this in Arabic. This exists. There has been research. And anyway, I feel that the way that Salma ended up structuring the book, what that does is show you, first of all, that it's not static, that our empowerment is not, you know, set in stone, that we can move. There are shifts, there are ebbs and flows, and it's incredibly empowering. And the literature is even more empowering when interspersed in this way. That was my reading of it. That's why I think the structure works so well.
And we also, oh, sorry, just last small point is that we did, in the end, we decided to strip off the dates on the pieces so that you can read them and not really know, you know, that was deliberate to make us think, to reassess our conceptions about progress in this respect, so-called progress, and when one is liberated and when one wasn't liberated in the region, so that they're undated. You can find out, and that was also to drive people to read the biographies at the back, because the writers themselves, their lives are so extraordinary and resourceful, and particularly with the contemporary writers. I was so fortunate to work with these women throughout lockdown. I mean, these are women who are multilingual, several careers, most of them. I mean, not just in terms of, and just brave, just really sort of challenging things on a very sort of personal level, or just pushing back a little bit, and that was a real inspiration to me.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in these letters of the slave girl Zaid Mehr, I had to look up the word tribbing. It was a word I didn't know in English, and that Emily Sila van Gert-Jan van Gelder had translated this. I mean, so that it was such a revelation that I didn't even have the terminology for the way in which she was writing about sex, and knew how to write about sex. A woman who was enslaved in the oppressive period.
I mean, the Zaid Mehr piece was a wonderful find, and it's the only piece of non-fiction. I mean, this is all fiction, all the accounts here, and it's one of the first times it's appeared, and it's so fresh, and it's so angered, and then so tender, and there's this I mean, she's got a really filthy mouth on her, Zaid Mehr, in Basra, but it's still, you can feel the intensity of the emotion of rage against this master, and then it sort of turns towards the end. It's a really impassioned piece. I'd love to see it acted, actually played out.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea. Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about that piece is that she was also really I mean, I have this tendency, like I'm sure many people, to sort of romanticize the Baghdad of the Abbasid era. And she talks about it, she says it's a paradise of the prosperous, hell to the poor. And I thought it was, so not just describing sex in sort of this visceral, direct way, but in describing the whole world in this direct way. And I wondered if there is, so like a good detective novel is also a sociocultural sort of exploration of what is crime and who's a criminal. If in the erotic literature you found that good erotic literature also explores sort of this sociocultural context in some way.
Yeah. I think it can. I mean, if you look at like the writer Anais Nin, who's like normally the name most associated with erotica, female erotica. I mean, her descriptions of Paris and of the worlds around her are really exquisite, as are her philosophical reflections. But because she wrote about sex so explicitly as a woman, that she's never really remembered for the other aspects of her writing. But she did do that particularly well. And I think it is something, I don't think it's always the case that erotic writing is very good on being descriptive of place, because I think sometimes it's like a sort of like maybe in a porn movie, you just have like, you want to get to the action, so it's all skimmed over, and then it's perhaps then in those occasions it's very flimsy. But what I do think is that if the erotic impulse or sexual tension or a sense of romantic yearning is depicted well by a writer, and this is one of the things that attracted me, because I think just as a skill set, it is one of the hardest things to get right, because you can say one word off and something which seems really exciting and wonderful and wondrous just becomes really icky and gross and disgusting. And it's just this fine line, and it varies from reader to reader, writer to writer. So it's if a writer, I think, is able to do that well, they're probably able to do other things well, because I think it's kind of the highest point of good writing, is to be able to get away, because it's such a tricky field.
Okay, we have a literary prize called the Bad Sex Awards.
Yeah.
Which celebrates absolutely horrendous sex scenes in books every year. Anyway.
It is a difficult thing. It is a difficult thing. And I wondered if, the writing about sex now is more, tends to be bad. Whereas, in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were just less afraid of writing about it because we're so tortured about writing about it. So Dr. Feria was asking about the title, and I also wanted to ask about the title and the jacket and the whole presentation of the book, and why you decided on this particular title and how that came about.
I'll just start by saying I did suggest quite a few titles, mainly coming from lines in the poems. And I love Lynn because she's so direct. She's like, no, I don't like that one. I don't like that one. But this was right in the early days when we hadn't even got the pieces. But this comes from a poem by Alaya bint Mahdi, and it just, for us, I think it just was immediately what we wanted. We wanted something which depicted, drew on the older pieces, but also looked at how language is sometimes coded when it's about things which are very important that you have to present. That it portrays the sort of the cover perhaps as well as the amount of symbols within the work. I mean, it was it's very hard with this book, I must say, because we've got 110 pieces. They're all very varying in theme and tone and writing style and language. Whenever I try to generalize over all of the works, it's very difficult, apart from the fact they're all quite good. But Lynn can talk more about the cover.
From a commercial perspective, I'm not sure if I'll be going into too much technical detail, so feel free to cut me off at any point. But, it is a commercial book, so the aim is to go for an evocative title, which this certainly is. It's and then have a sort of catchy but a subtitle that sort of explains what the book's about, with the following on from this idea of trying not to sensationalize or exoticize or orientalize, thinking about these things. It is a sort of difficult balance that we tread between incorporating Middle Eastern, Arabic calligraphy and motifs and calligraphy and such, but in a tasteful way and in quite a modern way, and in a contemporary way. I mean, so that's what we were seeking with the cover. I always think that less is more, if I'm honest. I think that the title and the subtitle say everything that needs to be said. And my biggest priority with the cover was I wanted something really sexy. I wanted to sort of it to exude. I'm not sure if the colors come out, but they're sort of these lush sort of purples and pinks and corals. Anyway, so I hope you like the cover. Yes.
I personally think it's a great cover, and I think you sort of anchored it in history by virtue of the borders that you use. There's a bit of a motif that is somewhat historic, Arab, Islamic in architecture, and I think the colors are just great. They're part of the massive. Yeah.
Thanks.
Whereas I see like a cervix on the.
Interesting. Not surprising that I would not see that.
So someone is asking about whether there's a possibility of publishing the same anthology of works either in the original Arabic or translated into Arabic.
That's a brilliant question. We have received an offer actually for Arabic rights, which we are. Sorry, I haven't told you yet, Salma. So watch this space. Hopefully, there'll be real positive news coming out soon. I mean, obviously, for all the Arabic pieces, they'll be reverting to the originals, they're not going to be translating back. This isn't sort of Chinese whispers. But important to note, that it took. Important to note how much work there is to be done, how much more scholarship, how many opportunities there are here. you know, for Arab scholars and for scholars of Arabic, if you see what I mean. So both here and from the region, but then in publishing, the fact that this exists in English first and then it's going to appear in Arabic, you know, it's something to think about. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But yes, it is an interesting note, I think.
So this same question asks about censorship and whether you know, the vocabulary would be in some ways, even though it's you know, the piece is written in Arabic, would be censored in Arabic. And then I just wanted to, you know, quickly throw in my own experience, and then to open that up with, which both Lena and Salma already know about, but which I wrote a review that was requested by a publication, and then accepted by my editor and championed by my editor, but then the piece was spiked and it caused large problems actually at the publication because of worry about sexual terminology, and we were sort of grinding away at it slowly. Oh, okay, I'll remove this bit about tribbing, although I was so fascinated by this term. Okay, I'll remove this. Okay, this poem by Muna Wafiq. Okay, you know, so gradually, until gradually they're just, and then it was taken down entirely. And I wanted to know whether, you know, what kind of care you've taken with it and when sharing the book. What kind of, even, you know, sort of self-censorship you may have done, or if you know of other people who've had trouble with it.
First of all, I'm so sorry that you had that awful experience. That's awful. I have taken no care whatsoever in how I present this book, because I'm proud of it and I won't self-censor. I publish in London. My colleagues publish in Beirut. So I do have to be mindful of my publications in London, because they can at times have a negative impact on them. Unfortunately, such is our reality. You know, I cannot publish absolutely anything. You know, I can't go completely wild, but I know that with this publication, they wouldn't get into any trouble. You see what I mean? You know, the 3 taboos, as I'm sure everyone here knows, in the Arab world, it's sex, religion, and politics. You know, in terms of books that are banned or censorship, I would say that more than half of our publications are banned in most Arab countries. That's just the way it works. Or our Mohammed Shukri books are banned in Egypt, yet in Egypt they sell tens of thousands of copies of Mohammed Shukri books. They're all the pirated editions, you know. The book so far, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been banned outright in any Arab country. But it's only been sold in one emirate in the Gulf at the moment, and in Lebanon. So it's not really a surprise, essentially. So it is making its way, and obviously there have been direct sales through our website and sales online, obviously, and sales of the ebook. But I think increasingly what's happening is that retailers and distributors in the Arab world are self-censoring themselves. So I'm not self-censoring, but I suspect that they are at their end, and I respect them completely, because they operate in it's quite a tight rope that they sort of have to navigate. So I defer to them in this instance.
What about you, Salma?
I mean, I love Lynn's spirit. I go through phases of being very sort of like, yes, I can do this, there's nothing wrong with this, it's been published before. But I think when I put all the pieces together, and it is love and lust, it started off, we had erotica in one of the subtitles, and then I decided to remove that because erotica has this implication within it that it's there to titillate, that the writing has, so you've kind of got an implied gaze coming up, you know, coming in, which I didn't really want. I wanted it to be more intimate. And there was also so much love in the work. So then we changed it from lust and the erotic to love and lust. So in terms of my sort of sense, when I put all the pieces together, I was kind of, and I read it in one go, I was kind of, when you see them in one piece alone, it's one thing, and they're all quite dense. But I did kind of get a little bit taken aback with quite how much sex there was. I mean, you're not always in the kind of the mood to sort of, read that many accounts. So I did move things a little bit, kind of, because I feel that sex scenes do have this, they kind of draw energy away from anything that's around that writing. They kind of like almost like a vacuum, that it takes all the attention from the rest of it. So it was a sort of like almost to give the reader a bit of a breathing space, that I was trying to pace those a little bit. I also, on my own sort of censoriousness, because I didn't want anything connecting Islam with violence or blood or anything like that. I wanted that to be out. And otherwise, no, it was just, if the quality was good, I mean, if it wasn't replicating other pieces that we had submitted, yeah. And I think the thing is now, I mean, there's just so much online content which is very sexualized, which is pornographic, which is being downloaded, which is totally made by men for men. And it's just one space where, where you're trying to create a dialogue in a way, or an insight of fictive pieces which, portray artfully this really important part of our existence, that some of us kind of lose out on. You can't communicate over it. People get gagged, they get embarrassed, they get shamed. And a book is a very private affair. It's just you and the word and what's going on in your imagination. So it's something which is, it's creating a new space, I guess.
So Ashraf is asking, thanks a lot to all of you. So after all, Salma, who in your perspective were more able to espouse their voice through writing in terms of the erotic dimension, Arab women in the past or Arab women in contemporary time?
Gosh, it's really hard to generalize. I think you have some of the contemporary writers who sound very like some of the ancient ones. There was one tiny little poem which came in from somebody who'd never published before, Sylvia El-Hello, and it's just about a kiss, and it's so sweet, and it's tiny, it's like a haiku, and it's very similar to some of the older works. And then we also have these very sort of, there's one called You Can't by Zaina Ghandour, which is very similar to some of the more sort of like the Sophia Al-Baghdadi piece I read, with this sort of self-assertive, this is who I am, what's your problem with it, voice. So you get these echoes across the time. I think there were definitely periods in sort of early 20th century which are quite muted. And there are writers who I could have included, but I wasn't, I just didn't have space to be able to. There are some, people like Ghada Sammam and other writers like the Spaceship to the Moon writer, who Ba'al-Baki, who were very sort of revolutionary in just using the I term, like in the 60s, like using the first person. And really, when you read her stories now, they seem so tame, but she had to go to court for this, It was just because the story was expressing desire and using the first person. So we've moved, there are very, that's the end of my answer. It was quite a long one.
Yeah, no, it would be great to see Spaceship of Tenderness to the Moon also translated into English.
It has actually appeared already. That was part of the reason it's appeared in the Hikayat Anthology by Saki in English. So it's there.
So Tala is asking, what is the best way to begin a journey of learning about similar works beyond this book? And Lynn, so there's the classical Arab poetry by women. What other anthologies and works that Saki has done?
Yes, so Classical Poems by Arab Women, edited by Abdallah Al-Udhari, is an incredible work, and that assembles pre-Islamic, so from the Jahiliyyah period to classical times, and I think it's over a longer period than is in this book, and it's a bit more scholarly. There are notes and such, and there are little biographies on each of the women as well, so similarly to this book. So that's brilliant, and that's a great introduction, actually. We publish a brilliant anthology called Desert Songs of the Night as well, and that features, the introduction is excellent, actually in that book. So that was edited by the late Suhail Bushri, who was a professor somewhere in North America. Sorry, I can't remember the university now. And he published a number of books, and James Malarkey. So that's, again, a sort of extensive anthology of Arabic literature from pre-Islamic to contemporary times. It's much longer than this, though. Not everyone's comparing, but yes. And it includes excerpts from each of the key sort of stages in our history. So I think those would be the main two. Otherwise, we have quite a few bilingual. Classical Poems by Arab Women is bilingual. So that our bilingual books are sort of cherished by students. Essentially, if you're learning Arabic or if you're teaching or anything like that, they tend to be quite useful. Otherwise, we have more contemporary collections of modern sort of contemporary short stories and such. It's all on our website. I feel like I'm sort of, I've probably said enough about our publications.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, part of the reason for the anthology was just to introduce readers to different writers, like through a common theme. So there are a lot of contemporary writers that, if you read the works, if you like the style, it's like, the way that, you gravitate towards certain friends, you can go to their biographies, look them up, see what they publish. It's not all about, the erotic is the thing which is, it's distinct, draws this book out, but a lot of their work is on other issues, and they're all just very good writers. So I would recommend that, you check them out, from Huda Barakat, Adania Shibli, Ahtaf Swaif, Malika Mustadraf, and the list goes on. It's really, we've got yes, Suad Amari, indeed, Hanan al-Sheikh, who was like such a force of joy to work with throughout putting this anthology together, because she's had this, her humor and her cheekiness and her wit and her cleverness was something which was kind of, encouraged me to sort of like think, well, let's be more playful, because we've all got everyone gets kind of down when they think about the Arab world, whereas she's like got this lovely kind of spirit to her. So yeah, and
she's brave also, because she's brave. I mean, some of her books, for example, did receive a lot of backlash, right, in some markets.
She did. And I would also say that, I mean, I once asked her about this thing of, because some of her books are very funny. And then she's also got some books like The Story of Zahra, which is very serious. And I do have this feeling that for women writers, if they're funny, they're considered not to really be able to deal with serious matters. Whereas actually, I think humor can be really quite an incredibly important political tool for writers, or it can denote seriousness as well, but a lot of writers veer away from it. But Rasha Abbas's piece in this as well is very funny and cheeky, and there's a side of her that you see here that I haven't seen in many of her, in other writing. It's a different side of her. But there's sometimes it's kind of.
I think what's wonderful is what's wonderful is allowing a space for Arab women to speak about something other than, politics, or, you can just be, as opposed to having to affirm or negate a position. And I feel like we're so often pigeonholed or boxed into having to represent, whether you are, do you see what I mean? And I think that's why I personally felt that this was such an empowering read, because for once we can just be, and there's a plurality of being, and that's celebrated here.
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, as you say, Selma, this collection itself is a door, as an anthology, is a door into many other works. Malika Mustadra, for instance, next month as a collection in translation by Alice Guthrie. So I think we just have time for one more question, and Lawrence was asking, and maybe we could open this up also to how can you describe how you unearthed some of the older pieces? Some of them, of course, appeared in this anthology, some of them otherwise. And then in general, how did you go about this sort of the balance of taking submissions, using pieces that you knew you wanted, and then asking other people for recommendations?
Yes, I mean, with the older pieces, I think that, which connects to the question of where can we go from here. I didn't do as much unearthing as I would have liked to. I didn't do archival research. I'm not a sort of medievalist. I didn't bring out. I can't say that there are any new pieces that haven't been. No, there were one or two that might not have been translated into English before, but most of them I drew on two anthologies, the Udhari one that I've already mentioned, and then Wissam and Mukliji's anthology of writing by women from up to the Andalusian period. So these two, the Maliji and the Udhari translations, anthologies are the two key ones. And then I also I had a network of academics at SOAS, some in Sweden, some in the US, and I was just asking them if there were other pieces that they'd identified. And I got a couple through that, but there were some leads that I couldn't pursue just simply for lack of time. It was then that I had certain parts of books I wanted from the outset, and I was really dogged about making sure I got those. There were some very groundbreaking writers like Leila Slimani, who has written about sex in a way which is quite, I mean, her Adele is very sexual, very forthright, bestseller in the West. So I wanted to see. I wanted a piece from that. I think also Salwa Al-Naimi, who again was one of the writers who sadly did have backlash when her book Taste of Honey came out. So sometimes there were people I wanted to include because they marked they reached a level of sort of pushing things, just opening things up a little, opening up space, and I wanted to see what their writing was doing. And others because they referred back, as in Salwa Naimi, to the older works in her writing, as do some of the contemporary poems like by Yasmin Seal, so that you've got this linkage. And then translators were a source of new material. And then we did put out a call just, for anybody on the writing circuit who was unpublished previously to come forward, because it's very difficult to get published if you haven't been. So that was to sort of open up that space, and we got some great.
How many pieces in the end?
Five, yeah. And we got, like a historic piece set in Bahrain in the 90s.
I think this is a big, the open call. Sorry.
Yes, carry on. But I mean, really extraordinary settings, even the ones I didn't accept. It was hard to turn them down because there was all these voices, all these people writing away, and I think it was it was a good thing to do.
So if we have sort of one last question, I would be curious, what books can we, would you like to see build on this? What books can you imagine being next, wanting to publish or wanting to edit or wanting to bring out in some way, just to read of somebody else's work? So if you imagine that this work is able to exist because of the classical Arab women poets, among other things, what comes next? What can be built on this book?
I'll answer fast if that's okay. I would like there to be more scholarly research and a sort of archive built around sort of pre-Islamic and classical up to contemporary sort of women's writing. And I would like that to be then obviously published, or parts of it published, so to be digitized and then available internationally. So that's the dream, and then of course we can translate it and then publish it internationally. That I think there's, as I said several times, that there is such a rich heritage of literature in our part of the world, and it's so central to our culture, throughout the ages, throughout the centuries. So there's a lot of work to be done. I would like for the women within this anthology to get book deals. I'd be very interested to publish probably most of them, the ones who are alive. I would like this to spur other Western publishers and English language publishers to engage in a more in a more, what's the word I'm looking for? Just subtle, nuanced, intelligent, sorry if that sounds rude, but, you know, way with Arab women writers, and, you know, to sort of branch out. And, you know, in 2017, we published another book called, obviously, The Things I Would Tell You, and that was an anthology. It's the first anthology in English in the UK. Not in America, there was one beforehand. In the UK by British Muslim women. And at the time, I remember people telling me, why? No one's going to buy this. It's going to flop, blah, blah, blah. It did not flop. It did very well, I just like to say. And then it spawned a sort of, there were 3 or 4 books by British sort of collections that then came out by much larger publishers, you know, in the following years. So this is how it starts, you know. Salma took the first step, but I think this is just the beginning. Inshallah.
Selma, did you have anything you wanted to say about what?
Well, no, I mean, specifically on the book form, I had one idea, which was I would be interested in looking at like an anthology which put together the voices, because there are a lot of medieval erotic pieces where you have a male narrator using a male writer using a woman's voice, and then I thought of juxtaposing that with like contemporary female writers who use male voices to talk about the same things, to sort of show how this kind of swapping around can kind of free up a space. That was on the book idea. And then I just think it's just I hope that for the readers and writers, it sort of helps to allow them to just be in the way that Lynn was saying so eloquently. It sounds so simple, but to just be, to explore that side of their life, and to have more women writers across the board in all genres. So TV is like huge now, you know, just get more TV writers from this region and writing for film, or to have theatrical performances of parts of this, you know, just it could be so, you know, very visually beautiful and empowering and powerful. I just, yeah, it's a sort of starting point, but it's a nice one to put together.
Thank you. So Safwan is going to take us out.
Thank you, Marsha. I don't want to take you out. I want us to stay in this conversation for a very long time. Thank you, Marsha. You're just such an incredible moderator, and thank you so much for doing this. Really. It's fascinating listening to all 3 of you. And Lean, a couple of things that you said, one about sort of what you hope will emerge, you know, future works, and you talked about scholarship, and I see in Salma's your explanation of and the approach that you took to the selections and to how you compose this book. There's a lot of, you know, very, very careful scholarship that went into it, you know, very careful thought, and I really appreciated hearing all of this. I have so many questions and some things that I hope that we can pursue at other times. For example, you know, what putting together this book has taught you about sort of the conditions of society and conditions of women in particular, you know, from looking at it from this prism over the ages in this part of the world, right? And where do women sit today? And you mentioned, Salma, for example, some pieces that were too muted, I think was the word that you used, from the early 20th century. And how does that compare to today? And how does that compare to some of what you've read, Lean read, you know, from the 11th century, right? And sort of, you know, how things might have evolved or developed over that period. I'll just end by saying that, you know, what really makes, you know, what the selections that you've made stand out, especially of contemporary writers, is that these people, these women insist on being, right? And like you said, Lean, and, you know, some of the people that we've discussed here, you know, whether it is Hanan Sheikh or Suad Amiri or Ahdaf Suwaif and many others, they just are. And that's what makes the writing so authentic and so beautiful. And that's, you know, where I want to end by just thanking you for being and, you for for doing what you do. This has been really, really amazing, and congratulations, Salma, and to everyone who participated in this. And thank you so much, Lena and Marsha. Thank you.
Thank you, Safwan.
Space
You.
to discuss the book. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who listened in. Get the book and read it. Okay. Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.